Everyone is asking the wrong question about AI. The question isn't whether AI is a bubble. The question is whether the gap closes before the Capex unwinds. In 2026, four companies, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Meta, will spend $725 billion on AI infrastructure. $725 billion in a single year, up 77% from last year. And in 2027, that number is projected to cross $1 trillion. Total AI revenue, by the most generous count, is about $90 billion. The gap is roughly 8 times. This is the most expensive bet in the history of corporate capital allocation, and the people writing the checks have not yet shown you the payback math. This is episode 1 of the AI Money Flow. Before we get to who profits, we need to be clean about the numbers. On the Capex side, Microsoft has guided to $190 billion in 2026. Google, also $190 billion. Amazon, $200. Meta, $145. Add Oracle and the smaller hyperscalers, and 2026 AI infrastructure spending lands around $750 billion globally. On the revenue side, you have 3 buckets people quote, and they overlap. Bucket 1, the model labs charging directly. OpenAI at $25 billion annualized, Anthropic at $30 billion as reported. Smaller labs maybe $5 billion combined. Bucket 2, cloud AI services, Microsoft's full AI business at $37 billion run rate, AWS Bedrock approaching $10 billion by year-end, Google Vertex undisclosed. Bucket 3, SaaS-attached, Microsoft Copilot seats, GitHub Copilot, Salesforce Einstein, Adobe Firefly, maybe $15 billion combined. These buckets double count badly. The clean, non-overlapping total is around $90 billion. That's the number the 8 times gap is measured against. So the 4 questions this episode answers. Where does the $725 billion actually land? Who is actually paying for AI? What historical cycle does this look like? And what variables decide whether the math works out? Where does $725 billion in a single year actually go? If you break the Capex stack into 4 layers, the rough split looks like this. Silicon, roughly $220 billion. That's GPUs and custom accelerators, dominated by NVIDIA, with Broadcom and AMD, and the hyperscaler custom chips taking the rest. NVIDIA alone will book around $250 billion in data center revenue this fiscal year, which makes sense because not all of it shows up in calendar 2026 Capex. Memory and packaging, roughly $100 billion. HBM3 and HBM4 from SK Hynix, Samsung, Micron, plus CoWoS substrate from TSMC, plus ABF substrate from Ibiden and AT&S. We covered every one of these in the previous 2 series. Power and real estate, roughly $200 billion. New data center buildings, transformers from GE Vernova and Eaton, switchgear from ABB and Schneider, transmission upgrades, and in some cases entirely new gas turbines and small modular reactors. This is the layer most underappreciated by chip-focused analysts. Networking, optics, cooling, storage, roughly $200 billion. Optical transceivers from Coherent and Lumentum, Arista and Cisco switches, Vertiv and Cooley liquid cooling, plus enterprise storage and the boring stuff. Here is the part the headlines miss. Of every dollar NVIDIA collects, about 50 cents flows back to the upstream supply chain. TSMC for manufacturing, ASML for lithography, Disco for dicing, KLA for inspection, Shin-Etsu for wafers, Synopsys and Cadence for the design tools. That money has already been earned. It is paid in cash, up front. The upstream supply chain does not care whether AI revenue ever shows up. They have already been paid. Now flip to the other side. Who is actually charging for AI? Start with the model labs that sell tokens directly. OpenAI hit $25 billion in annualized revenue in February of this year, up from $20 at the end of last year. Anthropic reported a $30 billion run rate in April, which OpenAI publicly disputed by about $8 billion because of how partner revenue is accounted for. Take the conservative number, call it $22 billion. Add the rest of the labs and the model lab segment is around $50 billion. Now the cloud AI services, Microsoft's broader AI business is at $37 billion, but that number includes the Azure compute that OpenAI itself buys to run its models, which is also counted inside OpenAI's $25 billion. AWS Bedrock is approaching $10 billion. Google Vertex doesn't disclose, but rough estimates put it at $5 to $8 billion. After you strip the double count, the truly incremental cloud AI revenue is maybe $20 billion. Then the SaaS-attached. Microsoft 365 Copilot crossed 20 million paid seats this quarter, which at a $30 list price after enterprise discounts gets you roughly $5 to $7 billion. GitHub Copilot adds 2, Salesforce Einstein, Adobe Firefly, ServiceNow, Workday, combined maybe another $5 to $8 billion. Clean total, after removing double counting, lands at around 80 to 100 billion. Generous count. Now here's what the bulls miss. The vast majority of that revenue is not yet profitable. OpenAI lost about $5 billion last year on $25 billion of revenue. Anthropic burns cash at a similar ratio. The cloud AI services run lower gross margins than the rest of cloud because GPU depreciation eats them alive. The 8 times Capex to revenue gap is not 8 times. It is closer to 40 times if you measure Capex against AI gross profit. 8 times gap, 40 times on a gross profit basis. Is that a bubble? Let's look at the last 4 Capex supercycles for comparison. Cycle 1, U.S. railroads, the 1880s. At peak, railroad Capex was roughly 4% of U.S. GDP. Half the operators went bankrupt in the 1890s depression, but the rails themselves stayed in the ground for a century. Infrastructure cycle, partial financial bust, permanent industrial benefit. Cycle 2, telecom fiber, 1998 to 2002. At peak, fiber Capex was roughly 1.2% of U.S. GDP. Capex outran revenue by about 4 times. The bust destroyed roughly $2 trillion of equity value. WorldCom, Global Crossing, Nortel all bankrupt. But the fiber itself was eventually lit and made YouTube and Netflix possible. Bubble cycle with permanent infrastructure overhang. Cycle 3, cloud computing, 2008 to 2013. AWS, Azure, Google Cloud Capex was 3 to 5 times current cloud revenue. The market questioned whether enterprise would ever migrate at the necessary scale. By 2020, the math had worked. Infrastructure cycle, no major financial bust, sustained return on capital. Cycle 4, current AI buildout. Capex roughly 0.9% of U.S. GDP. Capex to revenue ratio 8 times. Below the telecom danger zone, in the same band as the cloud buildout, and well below the railroad peak. The pattern that matters, AI Capex is more concentrated than any prior cycle. 4 companies are placing the entire bet. If they keep going, the math probably works in 7 to 10 years. If 2 of the 4 blink, the down cycle is fast and severe. The historical analog is not bubble or no bubble. The historical analog is who pays for the bridge years. 3 variables decide whether the gap closes before the Capex unwinds. Variable 1, the rate of token price decline. Per token inference prices have been falling about 50% every year since GPT-4 launched. That's faster than Moore's Law ever moved. Falling token prices are good for adoption. They let new use cases become economic, but they brutally compress unit margin for whoever is selling the tokens. The faster prices fall, the more revenue you need just to stand still. This is the single most important number to watch in 2026. Variable 2, enterprise adoption depth. An MIT study this past year found that 95% of generative AI pilots fail to make it to production. Not because the technology doesn't work, but because of integration, change management, and data readiness. The Capex case assumes that 95% number drops to 70 or 60 over the next 3 years. If it stays at 95, the demand never materializes at the scale being modeled. This is the biggest single source of downside risk in every hyperscaler model. Variable 3, GPU useful life. Hyperscalers depreciate GPUs on a 6-year straight-line schedule. That assumption is now under attack. Short sellers, including a recent Hindenburg-style report, argue real useful life is 3 to 4 years, given how quickly Hopper has been displaced by Blackwell and Blackwell will be displaced by Rubin. If accountants are forced to mark depreciation schedules down from 6 years to 4, hyperscaler operating margin compresses by roughly 400 basis points overnight. Meta and Microsoft would each take a roughly $25 billion non-cash hit. These three variables, token prices, enterprise adoption, GPU life, are the only three numbers that matter for the next 18 months. So who actually profits? 3 layers of definite winners, 2 layers of conditional. 1 layer is the only obvious, unanimous winner. Let me rank them. Definite winner 1, the upstream supply chain, TSMC, ASML, NVIDIA, Synopsys, Cadence, KLA, Disco, Shin-Etsu, SK Hynix, Coherent, Lumentum. Every one of these companies has already been paid in cash for Capex that is already committed through 2027. They do not care whether AI revenue ever materializes. The check has cleared. The Forgotten Monopolies series ended at this conclusion, and it has not changed. Definite winner 2. High-end enterprise software with native AI integration. Microsoft 365, Salesforce, Adobe, ServiceNow. They are not betting their P&L on AI working. They are charging higher prices for AI features bolted onto already profitable franchises. They make money whether AI Capex compounds or unwinds. Conditional winner 1, NVIDIA itself, conditional on inference share. Training share is secure for 3 more years. Inference share is contested by the 4 ASICs we covered in the prior series: Grok, Cerebrus, Trainium, and Broadcom's custom XPU. NVIDIA's 70% plus gross margin is sustainable only if inference doesn't fully bifurcate. Conditional winner 2, the Model Labs, OpenAI, and Anthropic. Conditional on enterprise switching cost. Whoever locks distribution first gets the SaaS multiple. The other one becomes a cloud margin business. The unanimous winner, and this is the surprise, is the end user. Token prices fell 50% last year. They will fall 50% again this year. Productivity benefits flow to whoever can deploy, and they cost less every quarter. The biggest beneficiary of the $725 billion in Capex is not any company. It is the user. That is the actual semiconductor industry view of who profits from the AI race. Next episode in the AI money flow goes 1 layer deeper into the revenue side. The token margin. OpenAI burns roughly $5 billion a year on $25 billion of revenue. That gap is not sales and marketing. That gap is the unit cost of running each token. Why is inference cost not falling fast enough to save the unit economics? Why does Claude Code at $20 per million output tokens look profitable, but actually isn't? And which architectural choices, speculative decoding, mixture of experts routing, prompt caching, actually close the gap versus just shifting the deck chairs? That's episode 2 of the AI money flow. If you want the actual industry view on where AI money flows, not the headline, not the narrative, the actual P&L, subscribe and stay with this playlist. 6 episodes. 1 question: who actually profits? This is VLS Tech Explained.